in a moment, but big news for the continent is that there's a new head of the African Development Bank, and I'm joined now by Godfrey Mutizwa of CNBC Africa, and he is in Côte d'Ivoire where that event has happened. Good evening to you, Godfrey. Can you give us the news of who's been appointed and the significance of that?
It is indeed a significant result, David. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Yeah, we can confirm, it's just been confirmed in the last few minutes that Akinwumi Adesina, Nigeria's candidate for the African Development Bank presidency, has indeed won that race with 58.1% of the total votes. That means both regional as well as non-regional members. For those who don't understand African politics and how the way the African Development Bank is structured, that means he has won both the support of African shareholders who are African governments and non-regional members who are countries outside of Africa, including the US, the European Union, Japan, and others. In the end, he did win 58.1%, and from the regionals, which is the African continent, he did got a 60.5% endorsement. So a very convincing victory in the end for Adesina, but that was after 6 hard-won rounds of electioneering and voting, in which 5 other candidates were eliminated. So in the first place, we had the Sierra Leone foreign minister being eliminated. He was followed by the Tunisian candidate. We also got the Chadian candidate coming up. The final 3 candidates, it was down to Adesina, it was down to the Cape Verde finance minister, Christina Duarte. It was also down to the finance minister of Chad, Bedumra, and Adesina carried it, David.
Godfrey, to what extent does the personality count in this institution? I mean, there's some institutions where there might be a personality at the top, but there's an ongoing bureaucracy, an ongoing policy situation where the individual perhaps doesn't make much difference. Does the individual of this institution, the African Development Bank, really set the tone and the style?
Well, David, this is one of those institutions. When you think about the African Development Bank, think along the lines of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So this is not just a technocrat who comes in, sits in the office, crunches numbers, and comes up with broad, grand plans that drive the continent. This is a leader. You need a leader as well as a technocrat, someone who's able to crunch the numbers and then translate them into a bigger vision. When you look at the work that Donald Kaberuka did in the last decade at the African Development Bank, you begin to understand the kind of level of leadership that is required. When you look at Donald, he was almost like statesman-like. And when he went around, people say he took the conversation around Africa to a higher level. And that's exactly the kind of leader that you are required, because it's not writing economic policies for African countries. It's looking at the whole African landscape, analyzing it, and understanding what interjections, what interventions are required in specific circumstances to try to help the continent to grow. So think continent-wide policies, think macroeconomic policies that fit in well with the current global narrative, and you understand the kind of leadership that the African Development Bank wants and the kind of leader that the institution is going to need going forward.
Well, given the new man's background, is he likely to be able to build cross-border relationships? Because there's obviously a political dimension to this as well. You're wanting buy-in from all the major economic players on the continent.
David, say that again. Sorry, I didn't hear you properly.
I'm saying, is the new incumbent able to build cross-border relationships? Obviously, there's a political dimension to this as well. It's not simply economics and lending. You've got to build relationships to get buy-in.
Absolutely. I think when you look at the work that he did in Nigeria, you get the sense of a man who's got a good grasp of what Africa should be doing. Not only did he speak about the work that needed to be done in Nigeria, but he also had thoughts around what was to be done around the African continent. I remember very well back in 2012, I think at the World Economic Forum annual meeting for Africa in Ethiopia, where this whole figure around 60% of the world's arable land lying in Africa, he was one of the key voices that were speaking about some of those issues. And he has also done work at the NGO level when he worked for the Rockefeller Foundation in Southern Africa. So he brings with him a wealth of experience in terms of on-the-ground work, and I think it's going to serve him very well indeed when he takes over as the new president of the bank come September 1, 2015. In the next few months, what we're going to see is obviously the handover process from Donald Kaberuka, who has led the bank very ably, by the way, as I said, raising it at the global stage and becoming, in a way, the new voice for Africa's development, for policies that develop as well as reduce poverty in Africa in the last 10 years.
Thanks very much to Godfrey Mutizwa in Côte d'Ivoire, reporting on the appointment at the top of the African Development Bank.